Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to Mr. Night Whisperer TT. Tonight, I want to take you to a place that feels ordinary on the surface. A downtown hotel, Kansas City, Missouri, 1935. A hotel where businessmen, travelers, and the curious checked in under the anonymity of rented rooms. But one man, who signed the register under the name Roland T. Owen, would never check out alive. What happened inside room 1046 is the kind of story that seeps under your skin. He was found beaten, bound, and barely breathing, yet insisted no one had harmed him. He paid for the room in cash, carried almost nothing with him, and left behind more questions than answers. Even after his death, strangers would appear to pay for his funeral, to send flowers, and to ensure his true name remained hidden. This case is unsolved to this day. Some say it reeks of gangland violence. Others whisper of secret lovers or shadowy figures known only as Don. But the truth, whatever it may be, has slipped through nearly a century of speculation, like smoke through a keyhole. Let's begin, not with the end, but with the arrival of the man who would come to haunt room 1046. I still remember the description given by the staff at the hotel president. It was January 2nd, 1935, when he walked in. A young man, somewhere in his 20s, maybe 25 at most. Dark hair neatly combed, a build neither strong nor weak, dressed in a simple suit that seemed too plain to call stylish. He looked like any other transient visitor. He could have been a salesman, a clerk on the move, maybe a man down on his luck. But there was something about him that unsettled the employees. When he signed the register, his pen scratched the name, Roland T. Owen, Los Angeles. His handwriting appeared slow, deliberate, like someone concentrating hard not to make a mistake. He paid in cash, a habit that immediately stood out, even then. And when the clerk handed him his key, room 1046, he asked for an interior room. No windows facing the street, no chance for sunlight to spill in. It was a request that caught the clerk off guard. Most guests preferred outward-facing rooms, with a view of bustling Kansas City. Owen, if that was truly his name, wanted the opposite. He wanted shadows. The bellboy who escorted him upstairs noted something odd too. Owen carried no luggage except for a small comb, a toothbrush, and a tube of toothpaste tucked in his pocket. No briefcase, no suitcase, no extra clothing. When asked if he needed assistance with bags, Owen simply shook his head. His expression remained flat, his voice quiet. He seemed polite enough, but his lack of possessions gnawed at the bellboy's memory later, once everything unfolded. Room 1046 itself was nothing remarkable. A simple bed, a nightstand, a desk, and a phone. But Owen seemed immediately intent on controlling the environment. He closed the blinds tight, leaving only the artificial glow of the lamp to wash over the pale walls. He placed his single toothbrush and comb neatly by the sink, as though these small items were proof of his belonging there. Then, he sat silently on the bed, staring into the dimness, as though waiting for something. That was the first impression staff had of Roland T. Owen. A man who slipped into Kansas City like smoke through a crack in the door. Ordinary enough to forget, strange enough to be remembered. Later that evening, the maid knocked to deliver fresh towels. When she entered, she noticed the blinds still drawn, the lights dimmed. Owen sat in a chair, silent, almost brooding. He allowed her to replace the towels, but instructed her sharply to keep the door unlocked. He was expecting a visitor. That request, too, left her unsettled. Most guests wanted the safety of a locked door. He wanted openness, as though someone's arrival was imminent. It was the first of many contradictions. Now, here's something worth pausing on. The 1930s were years when anonymity was easy to maintain. Hotels rarely asked for identification. Cash left no trail. Men could drift city to city under false names, and no one thought much of it. But what makes Owen different is the meticulousness of his secrecy. No baggage, no ID, a false name, and an odd insistence on keeping himself cloaked from the world. It suggests planning. It suggests fear, or perhaps guilt. That night, Owen made a series of phone calls. Witnesses would later recall his low voice, measured and serious. He seemed to be speaking with someone named Don. Over and over, that name surfaced in fragments of overheard conversations. Don, I'll meet you soon, or Don, I don't want to. Never more than a hint, never more than enough to paint a shadow. Some staff remembered another odd detail. Owen often kept the door unlocked, and at least once, the maid found him sitting silently in the dark. Not sleeping, not reading, not even smoking. Just sitting, waiting. It was as if room 1046 wasn't a room at all, but a stage. And he was the actor, rehearsing for an encounter that only he knew was coming. Over the next day, a few employees noticed a change. Owen was sometimes seen leaving the hotel, only to return quickly. He didn't socialize, didn't linger in the lounge or bar. His movements were clipped, almost as though he were under instructions. Then, one night, a woman was seen with him in the lobby. They sat together, talking quietly. She was described as attractive, with dark hair and a confident posture. Some thought she looked older than him, perhaps in her 30s. Their conversation was hushed, tense. Witnesses couldn't recall much, except for the sense that it wasn't casual, not friendly. By the time Owen went back upstairs that evening, a faint unease had spread among the staff. Something about him was wrong. But in the busy rhythm of a hotel, suspicion fades quickly. Guests are odd all the time. People travel with secrets. Who's to say what shadows they carry with them into rented rooms? Still, looking back, every small detail stands out. The cash payment, the lack of luggage, the insistence on shadows, the mysterious Dawn, the unnamed woman. Each fragment sharpens into a clue, or perhaps only the illusion of one. And the tragedy is this: when Owen lay dying days later, none of those fragments would add up. Not then, and not now, because the mystery of room 1046 was only beginning. When I think of Roland T. Owen, or whoever he really was, I picture a man who lived as though the walls themselves were watching him. Every action in room 1046 carried an air of calculation. He didn't just stay there. He inhabited it like a bunker. The maid who cleaned his room over those days gave us most of the details. She spoke of the atmosphere the moment she stepped inside. The room never felt lived in, yet it wasn't abandoned either. Towels folded but not used. The bed, often rumpled, yet rarely slept in fully, as if Owen never allowed himself the surrender of rest. He seemed constantly alert. One morning, she entered to find him sitting silently at the small desk, staring at a sheet of blank paper. He didn't acknowledge her at first. Only after a long pause did he say, "Don't bother with the bed today." His tone was low, detached, not unkind, but final. She left quickly, unsettled. It was his lack of belongings that struck her most. Hotels in the 1930s were full of travelers who carried entire wardrobes in suitcases. Yet Owen's possessions could fit in a single coat pocket. He had the clothes he wore, his toothbrush, his comb, and that was it. No hat box, no luggage, no wallet ever seen. For a man who claimed to have traveled from Los Angeles, it was unthinkably bare. The staff began to whisper about him. Some guessed he was a criminal on the run. Others suspected he was sick and didn't want anyone to know. A few thought he might be a detective himself, working undercover. Every theory seemed possible because he gave nothing away. When people passed him in the hallway, Owen rarely spoke. But once or twice he was heard muttering under his breath. Words half-formed, sentences unfinished, as though he was arguing with someone who wasn't there. That same week, another odd thing happened. A bellboy swore he saw Owen pacing the corridor late at night, dressed in nothing but his undershirt, his head lowered, hands clenched. The boy said he looked pale, almost feverish. When asked if he needed help, Owen froze, then shook his head and walked silently back into his room. It's moments like these that leave me wondering, was he truly afraid of something real, or was he unraveling from within? One strange fact about hotel culture in that era: anonymity wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Travelers often used false names, especially men drifting between cities. Some did it to escape debts, others for affairs. And yet, in most cases, they carried at least a suitcase or two to keep up appearances. Owen's refusal to bring anything tangible made him an anomaly. It was as if he wanted to erase all proof that he existed. Then came the phone calls. Staff overheard fragments, always in that same subdued voice. A woman on the switchboard remembered him saying, "No, Don, I don't want to," followed by a pause. On another night, she caught him whispering, "Fine, but not here." It was clear that Don wasn't a casual acquaintance. Don was someone who had a grip on him. And then, the strangest visitor of all. One afternoon, a man came by asking for Owen but never gave his own name. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with slicked hair and a sharp suit. The desk clerk described him as confident, even intimidating. He didn't go upstairs, but he lingered in the lobby for nearly half an hour, waiting. Eventually, he left without seeing Owen. The timing of that visit would linger heavily once the events of January 4th unfolded. The longer Owen stayed, the more the staff felt they were hosting a secret. There was tension in every small act: a towel delivered, a call connected, a door left unlocked. The man seemed both trapped and complicit, like he knew danger was coming but couldn't step away from it. And here's where scholars still debate. Was Owen a victim caught in someone else's web? Or was he playing a dangerous role of his own? Some criminologists argue he may have been involved in organized crime. The use of false names, the ties to a mysterious Don, and the possibility of clandestine meetings all fit the pattern. Others counter that his behavior was more consistent with someone being watched, possibly threatened, trying to obey instructions under duress. Whatever the truth, Owen left behind a trail of questions without answers, and soon his secrecy would take a violent turn. Because behind those locked doors, the waiting would end. The telephone sat on the small desk in room 1046 like a silent sentinel, black and heavy, the kind of device that carried voices but also secrets. In the 1930s, long-distance calls weren't made casually. They cost money, required operators, and left a faint trace. And yet, Roland T. Owen seemed tethered to that phone, his voice carrying down the switchboard line often enough for operators to remember him. The first reports of those calls were brief. The switchboard operator recalled the low, deliberate tone in which he spoke. She said he used clipped phrases, no wasted words. "Yes, Don, I'll be ready soon." Then silence. Another night. "You don't need to bring that. No, not here." Always punctuated with pauses, as though someone on the other end was instructing him. To the staff, the name Don began to feel like a ghost in the hotel. No one ever saw him, yet his presence loomed. Every call seemed to circle back to him, a shadowy figure existing only through whispered exchanges. One evening, the maid came in to replace towels. The phone rang while she worked. Owen picked it up, listening intently. She remembered his expression stiffening, the veins in his neck tightening. He spoke just 3 words. "Yes, Don. Yes." Then he hung up abruptly, as if he had just agreed to something inevitable. This phone tether grew stranger by the day. Calls came at odd hours, sometimes deep into the night. Witnesses recalled hearing his voice muffled through the door, never raised in anger, but always subdued, submissive, a man negotiating or perhaps obeying. There's an important context here. The 1930s in Kansas City were steeped in corruption. Political machines and organized crime families held influence over businesses, even hotels. Phone lines could carry not just words but instructions from men who operated in shadows. Some researchers argue that Owen may have been an errand runner, a courier caught up in dealings too big for him. Others believe he was hiding from those very figures, taking calls that dictated his movements like a puppet on a string. But the phone calls weren't the only strange communication. Guests on the same floor claimed to have heard a man's voice through the walls of room 146, low and steady, sometimes conversing with someone unseen. And yet, when staff entered, Owen was alone. Was he speaking to someone hidden or repeating words fed to him through the receiver? One particular night would stand out. A guest in the room next door reported hearing a heated exchange. A man's voice said sharply, "No, Don, I don't care what you think." Silence followed. Then a softer tone. All right, I'll do it." The witness couldn't be sure if Owen was on the phone or speaking to someone in the room. But that moment marked a shift from passive obedience to quiet resistance. The detail that unsettled investigators later was the timing. Several of these phone calls occurred just hours before Owen was found beaten. The final calls, overheard faintly, suggested mounting pressure, as though some decision had to be made that night. A strange fact about the hotel industry at that time: operators often recognized frequent callers by voice. One switchboard worker insisted she could distinguish Owen's subdued tone instantly. She also claimed she once heard another male voice faintly on the line, deeper and more authoritative, though she couldn't identify it. That testimony added weight to the theory that Owen was answering to someone. Scholars continue to debate this aspect of the case. Was Don a real person, part of organized crime? Was he a jealous lover, perhaps part of a clandestine affair? Or, as some psychologists suggest, was Don a projection of Owen's fractured state of mind? A name he invented to disguise conversations with himself? What we know is this: the calls were real. The operator remembered them, and they grew more intense as the days passed. Each one seemed to chip away at Owen's composure, leaving him more agitated, more restless. And then one night, the conversation escalated beyond words, because soon others on the floor would hear more than voices. They would hear sounds of struggle, and the secrecy of the calls would explode into violence. The longer Roland T. Owen stayed inside room 1046, the more the hotel staff felt a chill whenever his door number appeared on their rounds. He wasn't loud, he wasn't rude, and yet there was a tension about him. A feeling that entering that room meant stepping into someone else's secret. The maid, Mary Soptic, remembered her third visit most vividly. It was late morning when she knocked. His voice came from inside, quiet but firm. "You may enter." She opened the door to find the blinds drawn once again. The room was dim, a single lamp on, air stale as though nothing had been opened for days. Owen sat on the edge of the bed, shirtless this time. Across his back were faint bruises, marks she couldn't help but notice. They weren't the kind a man gets from bumping into a table. They looked deliberate, as though someone had gripped him hard or struck him in ways meant not to kill but to remind. When she hesitated, he looked at her sharply and said, "Leave the towels there. Don't lock the door. I'm expecting someone." That phrase, "I'm expecting someone," was repeated often. It became his refrain. Whoever he was waiting for, it seemed the meeting was always imminent, but never arrived while staff were present. Another detail unsettled Mary. On the desk sat nothing but a single glass tumbler, a comb, and the black telephone receiver resting crookedly off the hook, humming faintly. He didn't rush to put it back. It was as though the open line was part of his routine, a connection to someone unseen. Later that afternoon, she returned with fresh linens. Again, the blinds were drawn. This time, Owen was standing by the window, though there was nothing to see beyond it but the brick wall of the next building. His posture was rigid, his arms crossed. When she offered to clean the room, he shook his head. "Not now," he murmured. "Not while he's here." Mary froze. She looked around. No one else was visible. The bathroom door stood open. The closet was empty. The room was silent except for that faint electrical hum of the phone line. She wanted to ask, who? But his tone made her leave without a word. This incident would haunt her later, when police asked whether anyone else had been inside room 1046 during Owen's stay. She could only repeat his words, "Not while he's here." That night, other guests began to notice disturbances. A woman across the hall complained of muffled voices carrying through the thin hotel walls. At first, she thought it was just a conversation, but the tone grew sharper, angrier. A man's voice barked something she couldn't catch, followed by a softer reply. She swore she heard someone cry out, not a full scream, but a pained sound cut off quickly. When she mentioned it to the desk clerk, he shrugged. Hotels in the city often housed arguments. Couples fought, men drank too much, voices rose and fell. It wasn't enough to summon police. Still, there was something in her account that stood out. She said the argument ended abruptly, and after that, silence pressed against the walls like a held breath. An odd fact about the hotel president: its walls were notorious for carrying sound. Jazz music from the ballroom on the lower floors, laughter from the lounge, the creak of footsteps in hallways, all of it bled into the rooms. Yet when Owen stayed, his room seemed insulated. Staff often remarked that stepping inside felt like crossing into a vacuum. Dim light, heavy quiet, and a man who spoke as little as possible. The noises reported that night were therefore all the more jarring. And then came the following morning, when the maid once more approached with fresh towels. She knocked. A gruff voice answered, deeper than Owen's usual tone, "We don't need any." Mary hesitated. She was certain it wasn't Owen. It sounded older, heavier, authoritative. But when she pressed her ear, all she heard afterward was silence. This was the first clear indication that another man had been inside room 1046. But who he was and why no one saw him enter or leave remains one of the most baffling aspects of the case. Looking back, criminologists debate whether that moment was the beginning of the end. If Owen had truly been under someone's control, then by that morning, control had turned to surveillance. He wasn't just waiting anymore. He was no longer alone. And that presence would soon reveal itself in violence. It was the morning of January 5th, 1935, when the case of Roland T. Owen turned from unnerving to catastrophic. The staff at the hotel president had grown used to his odd routines, the dim light, the drawn blinds, the soft commands never to lock his door. But that morning, the hotel switchboard noticed something wrong. Room 11046's phone was off the hook. Ordinarily, a disconnected line was a minor inconvenience. Guests sometimes knocked the receiver off by accident. But when, after an hour, the line remained open, the switchboard girl made a note and called for a bellboy to check. The young bellhop, Charles Blocker, knocked softly at first. No reply. He tried the door, but it was locked from the outside. That, too, was odd. If Owen was inside, he hadn't thrown the deadbolt. It meant either he had locked it himself with the key from the inside and removed it, or someone else had locked him in. Blocker knocked again, louder. This time, a muffled voice answered, "Come in." But he couldn't. The door remained locked. Through the narrow crack between the frame and the jamb, Blosher pressed his ear. He heard something. Movement, perhaps, but slow, dragging. He called out again, asking if the man inside would replace the receiver. The voice repeated, weaker this time, "Come in. Turn on the lights." Blocher explained he couldn't enter without a key. After a moment of hesitation, he left, unsettled. It wasn't until a few hours later that another bellboy, Owen Gannon, tried again. The phone was still off the hook. This time he brought a master key. When he cracked open the door, what he saw chilled him. The curtains were drawn tight, as always, and the single dim lamp cast a yellow glow across the room. On the floor, half crouched beside the bed, was Owen. naked, his arms wrapped around his stomach, his body glistening with sweat. The walls bore smears of something dark, and for a moment the bellboy thought it was just bad lighting. Then he realized it was blood. The sheets were stained. The carpet held tacky, drying patches. And the telephone, receiver still dangling, swayed slightly as though disturbed. "Turn on the lights," Owen muttered again, though the lamp was already on. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. Shaken, the bellboy closed the door gently and hurried back downstairs to fetch the manager. When they returned minutes later with a doctor in tow, they forced the door fully open. The sight inside would haunt every man in that hallway. Owen had collapsed against the bed, his head bowed. His wrists bore ligature marks, deep and angry. His chest and abdomen showed stab wounds, not one, but several. The doctor quickly counted them, realizing he had been pierced multiple times with a sharp blade. Blood seeped from each, though some were already clotting, meaning the attack hadn't just happened, he had been bleeding for hours. Yet the strangest fact wasn't just that he was still alive. It was how long he had endured. Forensic pathologists later debated this point heavily. How could a man, stabbed repeatedly in the chest, stomach, and even punctured in the lung, have remained conscious long enough to answer the bellboy and ask for the lights? Some argue it was sheer willpower, a refusal to collapse until his message, whatever it was, could be delivered. Others suggest adrenaline or shock can keep a body moving long past the point of collapse. But in Owen's case, the medical consensus was that he had been slowly tortured over many hours, his injuries inflicted in stages, as if someone wanted to keep him alive in agony rather than kill him swiftly. When police finally arrived, Owen managed a few words. They asked who had done this. His answer, whispered and rattling in his throat, was chilling. Nobody did this. And then, after a pause, he added, "I fell against the bathtub." The officers exchanged looks. Clearly, he had not. No fall could explain the stab wounds, the ligatures, the bruises. And yet, he stuck to that impossible explanation, as though he had been instructed never to reveal the truth. Within hours, Owen would slip into unconsciousness, his body unable to sustain the blood loss. But the mystery he left behind, those words, that denial, would set investigators on a search that would twist in directions no one expected. And behind it all still lingered the unanswered question: who was Don? The morning discovery, phone off the hook, bellboys entering, Owen's injuries revealed, his cryptic denial. For Part 6, the outline points us toward the police investigation begins. Hospital reports, detectives arriving, first interviews with staff, and the strange refusal of Owen to identify himself before slipping into unconsciousness. We'll lean into the forensic findings, the first theories, and the unsettling realization that this man seemed determined to remain anonymous, even in the face of death. Part 6. At the General Hospital in Kansas City, the man known as Roland T. Owen was wheeled into surgery. The doctors cataloged his wounds with a kind of grim disbelief. He had been stabbed at least 3 times in the chest, once deep enough to puncture his lung. His skull bore blunt force trauma, likely from being struck by something heavy, and his wrists, bound with cord, bore raw indentations that told their own story: restraint, possibly torture. The physicians agreed on one thing: he should not have survived as long as he did. Hours had passed since the first blows, yet he had remained upright, answering doors, even speaking. They called it one of the strangest cases of endurance they had seen. Detectives from the Kansas City Police Department soon crowded the hospital's corridors. Chief Detective Ira Johnson was among the first on the scene. He was a man seasoned by years of Prohibition-era violence, yet what he saw disturbed him deeply. This was not a robbery gone wrong, not a lover's spat, but something colder. They tried once more to speak with the victim. "Who did this to you?" Johnson asked softly, leaning close. The man's eyes fluttered open, hazy and bloodshot. His lips trembled. "Nobody," he whispered again. "I fell." That would be the last coherent thing he said. Minutes later, he slipped into a coma, never to wake again. The news of his death, officially at 12:05 a.m. on January 5, 1935, was carried down the sterile hallway, and for the detectives, the real work began. Back at the hotel, officers combed through room 1046. What they found only deepened the mystery. The blood spatter told a chaotic tale. Pools had gathered on the carpet, streaks on the walls, and even smears across the bedding. It was clear that Owen had fought, or at least moved, throughout the room while injured. But the crime scene offered something even stranger: the absence of fingerprints. Police dusted every surface, from the telephone to the glass tumblers on the desk. And yet, each print they lifted came back smeared, blurred, deliberately wiped. It was as though someone had gone through the room with methodical care, erasing every trace of their identity. And then there was the clothing. None of it belonged to the victim. His own dark suit, shirt, and shoes were missing entirely. Instead, police found a single label torn from a necktie and a tag from a men's undershirt, both stripped of store or manufacturer information. The only thing he had arrived with, it seemed, was a comb, a brush, and an unused tube of soap. Why would a man check into a hotel with nothing but the barest toiletries under a name that might not be his? Theories formed quickly. Some officers suspected a mob connection. Kansas City was no stranger to organized crime in the 1930s. Others whispered about blackmail or a clandestine romance gone awry. The strange figure of Don was already being discussed in the squad room as though he were real, though no one had seen him. One curious detail in the case file became a point of heated debate among criminologists later: the cords found in the room. Investigators believed they had been used to bind Owen, but some suggested they might have been part of a ritualistic staging, placed to confuse the police. The press, too, caught wind of the story almost immediately. The Kansas City Star printed its first article by the afternoon of January 5th, the headline bold: "Man found near death in hotel room dies, identity in question." Reporters hounded the detectives for details. Who was he? Where had he come from? Why had he insisted that no one was responsible? And what about this mysterious Don? The police gave little away. They needed answers of their own. A body with no identification, no wallet, no documents, and no next of kin. The name Roland T. Owen might not even be real. The search to uncover his true identity was about to begin. And with it came one of the strangest chapters in Kansas City's criminal history. Before we move on, let me pause a moment. Stories like this, stories of nameless men, erased fingerprints, and voices in locked rooms, they can stay with you. If you're listening and you find yourself pulled deeper into the shadows with me, consider subscribing to this channel. Each week, we unravel a new case, slowly, carefully, like peeling back wallpaper in an old room to reveal the cracks beneath. And since we're on this journey together, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time glows on your clock as you drift into the dark with me? At the city morgue, the body of Roland T. Owen was laid out under a sheet, cold and silent. Yet, for the police, his death was not the end. It was only the start of a new riddle. Who was this man? Detectives canvassed every lead. They checked hotel registries across the city, calling managers to ask if a man of his description had stayed elsewhere. To their surprise, the Mulebach Hotel, just blocks away, reported that a similar man had indeed been a guest, quiet, with few possessions, using another false name. The pattern suggested he had been drifting, shifting identities, perhaps hiding from someone. Or, more unsettlingly, perhaps hiding from everyone. When the Kansas City police released his description to the press, the papers eagerly published it. Mid-20s, about 5'10", brown hair, scar on his temple, cauliflower ear on the left. He could have been a boxer, some said, or maybe a man who'd spent too much time in backroom fights. But days passed, and no relatives came forward. No friends claimed him. The hotel staff and detectives privately began calling him the Ghost Man. By mid-January, with the body still unclaimed, the county prepared to give him a pauper's burial, the anonymous grave of a man without a name. But then, something unexpected happened. The Melody Funeral Home received a phone call. A man's voice, calm but insistent, asked that Owen not be buried in a potter's field. He would send funds to ensure a proper funeral. When asked who he was, the caller refused to give his name. He only said he did not deserve to be buried that way. Worcester, he was a good boy. The funeral director pressed him further. Who was this good boy? The voice grew firmer. Don't worry, the arrangements will be taken care of. True to his word, an envelope arrived soon after, filled with cash, enough to cover an expensive funeral and flowers. All unsigned. The mystery deepened when another anonymous call came through to a local florist. The order, put roses on the grave, and write on the card, love forever, Louise. Detectives were baffled. Who was Louise? A wife? A lover? A pawn in something larger? The police never managed to trace the calls. And so, in early March 1935, the man who checked in as Roland T. Owen was given a proper burial in Memorial Park Cemetery, Kansas City. The service was quiet, attended only by detectives and a few staff who had known him briefly. The flowers, blood-red roses, lay across his coffin like a final message from someone who refused to reveal themselves. For years afterward, criminologists would argue about this moment, the funeral, the calls, the roses. Some believe it proved that Owen had indeed been entangled in a criminal underworld, that Don, or someone like him, had ordered the hit but still felt compelled to honor his memory. Others argue it was a woman, perhaps truly Louise, keeping her distance to protect her own name. The most unnerving theory, though, is that it was neither. That the money, the flowers, and the phone calls were meant only to send a message. We can erase a man's life, but we can also stage his death exactly as we choose. The police, for their part, had little to go on. The case seemed to be growing colder by the day, and yet in the shadows, there were still clues waiting to be uncovered. If the death of Roland T. Owen was strange, what followed in the weeks after was stranger still. The telephone at the Kansas City Police Department rang more than once, and each time it was a voice from the shadows, men and women who claimed to know something, yet gave away nothing that could be verified. One call, logged on January 6th, came from a man who refused to identify himself. He said he knew Owen's real name and background, but he would not tell the police. He only insisted he got what was coming to him. Then the line went dead. Another call came later that week to the Kansas City Star's newsroom. A woman's voice, calm, firm, maybe late 30s, told a reporter, "You have the wrong name. Don't believe what's been printed. He lived in Los Angeles. He was not from here." Before the reporter could ask another question, she too hung up. It was becoming clear that someone, or perhaps several someones, wanted to shape the narrative without stepping into the light. Detectives began cross-checking missing person reports from across the country. They wired Los Angeles, Chicago, New York. For every description they sent out, dozens of replies came back. Boxers, drifters, young men who had vanished in the Depression's shadow. But no match was certain. Meanwhile, the funeral director at Melody Chapel reported something odd. The day after the anonymous payment arrived for Owen's burial, he received another call. A man this time with a clipped, almost businesslike tone. He said, "There will be 3 others. Don't get involved." 3 others. The director was unnerved enough to write it down, and that note ended up in the police file. Yet, no 3 men appeared. No pattern emerged. Was it a threat? A warning? A lie meant to distract investigators? No one could say. One of the most hotly debated aspects of the case in criminology circles is whether these calls came from a single orchestrator or from different voices in the same circle. Some scholars argue that Don himself was making them, ensuring his control over how Owen's death would be perceived. Others insist it was Owen's associates, perhaps gang members, perhaps lovers, each trying to cover their own tracks. The evidence, frustratingly, pointed both ways. And then there was the wire. A detective later reported that a strange telegram had been sent from a nearby Western Union office, only blocks from the hotel, just days before the murder. It was addressed to an unknown recipient in another city. The message read simply, "Don't try to find him. He's okay." The handwriting on the slip was hurried, slanted, as though the sender wanted to disappear quickly. Could it have been about Owen? The police thought so, but when they traced the sender, the lead went nowhere. Paid in cash, no signature, and the clerk remembered nothing beyond a man in a fedora who didn't want to be noticed. In 1935, that described half of Kansas City. The weight of the mystery pressed on detectives. Each time they thought they had a thread, it slipped away like smoke. The voices on the line, the anonymous payments, the telegrams, all of it suggested not random violence, but a carefully managed performance, with Owen's life and death staged like a play where the audience would never know the ending. For the public, the case was both terrifying and tantalizing. Newspapers couldn't get enough of it. Columnists wrote that Kansas City had its very own locked room murder. Letters poured in, some claiming psychic visions of the crime, others accusing local mobsters, still others whispering of jealous lovers. The police, though, faced a chilling reality. The only person who had known the truth had taken it with him into the grave. And yet, the grave was not silent. Flowers kept arriving, fresh roses, sometimes lilies, placed by unseen hands. Always with cards unsigned, someone still cared enough to visit, someone who didn't want the name forgotten, even as they fought to keep the truth buried. And so Roland T. Owen, whoever he truly was, remained suspended between anonymity and legend, while the phone lines of Kansas City hummed with voices that refused to show their faces. For nearly a year, the man buried under the name Roland T. Owen remained a cipher. Detectives cycled through their theories. The public slowly moved on to fresher scandals and crimes. The hotel washed the stains from room 1046 and opened it to new guests, though many staff whispered it was cursed. And yet, in a quiet neighborhood hundreds of miles away, a mother sat at her kitchen table, staring at a newspaper clipping. The year was 1936. Ruby Ogletree of Birmingham, Alabama, had not seen her son Artemis in over 2 years. He had left home in his late teens, restless, eager for adventure. She received postcards now and then, Denver, Los Angeles, New York, each one proof that he was still alive. The last letter she remembered came in early 1935, signed not in his usual hand, but typed. It read strangely, too formal, too stiff. "I am fine. Do not worry." It was signed Artemis. Yet she knew at once. Those weren't her son's words. When a family friend returned from Kansas City with a clipping of the Room 1046 mystery, Ruby's heart froze. The photograph printed alongside the article, grainy though it was, showed the face of the dead man. She knew those eyes, that jawline, the scar on his head from when he fell as a child. It was him. Her boy, Artemis Ogletree. Just 17 when he left home, only 20 when he died. When she wrote to the Kansas City police enclosing his photographs, the confirmation came swiftly. The man buried as Roland T. Owen was indeed her son. The false name, the secrecy, the strangeness of it all, it wasn't an alias of a seasoned gangster. It was a young drifter, caught in something he could not escape. Detectives were staggered. For months, they had assumed they were dealing with a seasoned criminal. Instead, it was barely a man grown, a boy with little more than a suitcase and a hunger for travel. Ruby's testimony added another bizarre layer. She showed them the typed letters she had received. The words insisted Artemis was traveling to Europe. One letter even described his time in Cairo and claimed he was sailing to France next. But when the detectives studied them, they knew. Artemis had never written those words. Someone else had sent them, after his death, to cover their tracks. The thought chilled Ruby. Whoever had killed her son had also taken the time to sit at a typewriter and send false reassurances to a grieving mother. A cruel deception, calculated to delay her suspicions and give them more time to vanish. In criminology circles, this detail is often seen as the most haunting part of the case. The killer, or killers, didn't just want Artemis dead. They wanted to erase him from the world, to stretch his shadow across oceans, to make his family believe he was safe, to rewrite the story of his life even after it ended. Police now had a name, but they still lacked a motive. Why would anyone torture and murder a young man with no criminal record, no known enemies, no fortune to his name? Some investigators leaned toward organized crime. Perhaps Artemis had fallen in with the wrong crowd, offered to run errands, and paid the price. Others suggested a jealous lover, noting the mysterious Louise, who had ordered roses for his grave. A darker theory speculated that Artemis had been lured into some form of clandestine ring, not for money, but for control. The telephone calls, the typed letters, the wiped fingerprints, all signs of a coordinated group rather than a lone killer. For Ruby, the debates mattered little. She had her answer, but no closure. Her boy was gone, and the faces of those who had ended his life remained invisible. And in Kansas City, detectives were left staring at a deeper abyss than before. They finally knew the victim's name, Artemis Ogletree, but his death only became more bewildering with that truth revealed. With the mystery man now revealed as Artemis Ogletree, detectives redoubled their efforts. The Kansas City police interviewed the hotel president's staff a second time, this time with photographs of Artemis in hand. The bellboys, the maid, the switchboard girl, all confirmed it was him. Their unease grew when they realized the boy they had served meals to, the one who had asked them to keep his door unlocked, had been barely 20. Seemed older, the maid recalled softly. Carried himself like someone who had already seen too much. The detectives combed through the hotel registry again. The signature, Roland T. Owen, was scrutinized by handwriting experts, who noted it looked hurried, unnatural, as though he hadn't chosen the name for himself, almost as if someone had told him what to write. And then there was the phone. That old black rotary, dangling by its cord, blood dripping onto the receiver. It became a symbol in the investigation, the one piece of evidence that had linked the outside world to room 146. Calls made, voices heard, Don's presence implied but never confirmed. When detectives pressed the hotel staff about Don, their stories wavered. The maid swore she'd heard Owen say, "No, Don, I don't want to eat." The switchboard recalled Owen muttering that he wasn't allowed to let people into his room while Don was here. But no one could describe Don. No guest by that name had been registered. No man matching the description of Owen's supposed companion had been seen leaving the hotel. Yet all of them agreed Owen hadn't been alone. The press seized on this figure. Don became a phantom villain in the headlines. Was he a gangster, a jealous lover, a spurned friend? Editorials speculated wildly. One reporter wrote, "Perhaps Don is not a person at all, but a shadow name, code for a secret society." Meanwhile, detectives tracked down every Louise they could find connected to Artemis. Girlfriends, distant cousins, even co-workers from brief jobs he'd held before leaving Birmingham. Each woman denied knowledge of roses or phone calls. None had been in Kansas City. Yet the florist's order was undeniable. A voice had said, "Love forever, Louise." There were other small, baffling details. The hairbrush and comb Owen had arrived with, traced to a Los Angeles drugstore. The torn labels from his clothing, so carefully removed it was clear they had been cut with scissors. And the typed letters to Ruby Ogletree, mailed after his death, some with stamps postmarked from Chicago. The deeper detectives dug, the more it felt like a web spread across cities. Kansas City, Los Angeles, Chicago. Voices on phones, typewritten lies, flowers sent to graves. And yet, each thread ended abruptly. Years later, criminologists would argue whether this web was real or imagined, whether Owen's murder was the work of a single jealous companion or a sign of something organized. Some claim it was a personal betrayal. Artemis had trusted the wrong man, and Don killed him in a fit of rage. Others argue for conspiracy, that Owen had stumbled into criminal dealings, and his death was staged carefully to silence him and confuse authorities. The strangest possibility still lingers among academic debates, that Owen was not the only victim. Remember the chilling call to the funeral home, "There will be 3 others." Some scholars wonder if 3 others did die, scattered in other cities, their stories never linked because no one was looking. But for Kansas City's detectives in 1935, all they could see was a locked room, a dying man, and silence where answers should have been. And silence, in its way, can be more terrifying than truth. Time passed, but the memory of room 11046 refused to fade. Kansas City had seen its share of crimes, but none like this. The case lingered in police files as unsolved homicide. For detectives who had worked it, the photographs of that narrow hotel room, bed stained with blood, telephone off the hook, towel soaked red, became a kind of haunting. The hotel president carried on. Guests checked in and out. Bellboys carried luggage past room 1046 without a thought. But every so often, someone would whisper, "That's where the boy died." By the late 1930s, crime magazines picked up the story, splashing it across sensational covers. They called Owen the man with no name and the Phantom of Kansas City. Writers exaggerated the details, claiming he had spoken in riddles or that coded notes were found in the room. Readers ate it up. Yet what struck scholars more wasn't the embellishments. It was the way the real facts were already stranger than fiction. A young man, traveling under a false name, a mysterious companion known only as Don, a dying statement insisting nobody had hurt him. Flowers and letters arriving from unknown hands. It was as if the case had been constructed to resist understanding. One criminologist later remarked, "The Owen case reads like a stage play written by someone intent on denying the audience its final act." And still, the case had aftershocks. Reporters returned to the story each year on its anniversaries. Ruby Ogletree gave interviews, holding up her son's picture, insisting that someone out there knew why he had been killed. In Birmingham, friends of Artemis remembered him as restless, eager to see the world, but naive. He trusted people too much, one acquaintance said. If someone told him they had an opportunity, he'd follow it without question. That vulnerability fueled speculation that Don had lured him into something dangerous. Some suggested organized crime. The 1930s were the height of Prohibition-era gangs, and Kansas City was known for corruption. Perhaps Artemis had witnessed something he shouldn't have. Others leaned toward a darker psychological explanation. Was Don a figment of his mind? Was Owen trapped in a spiral of paranoia, staging details himself? If so, who had struck him down with such brutal force? The truth was that the case became less about Owen himself and more about what people projected onto him. He became a mirror for fear, of betrayal, of the unknown, of how easily a person could vanish into another name and another life. Strange fact of this period. In 1937, a nearly identical case occurred in New York, where a man under an alias was found beaten in a hotel room, muttering about a companion no one had seen. The cases were never officially connected, but criminologists still debate whether it was coincidence or evidence of a larger pattern. That sparked another round of arguments in academia. Some scholars proposed that transient young men of the Depression era, like Owen, were especially vulnerable to exploitation by gangs, cults, or drifters. Others rejected the sociological angle, arguing instead that Room 146 was simply a one-off killing made unforgettable by its bizarre trappings. But the longer time stretched, the more Owen became less a case and more a legend. And legends have a way of growing sharper as years go by. Dives into the enduring rumors, supposed sightings of Owen, whispers about Don resurfacing, and how the case twisted itself into folklore. This section will balance eerie anecdotes with the frustration of official dead ends. Part 12. Rumors are like smoke, impossible to grasp, but quick to fill a room. And when the Room 1046 case slipped out of the newspapers, it didn't vanish. It smoldered in whispers. People swore they saw Roland T. Owen, or Artemis Ogletree, in places he couldn't possibly be. A farmer in Missouri claimed he passed the young man on a back road, hitchhiking, weeks after the murder. A hotel maid in Chicago insisted she checked in a guest with his same face, scar above the ear, the year after. Each report collapsed under scrutiny, but the stories added fuel to the fire. Then there were the Don rumors. One Kansas City bartender told police he overheard two men talking about the boy in the President Hotel. One of them, he claimed, was called Don. Investigators followed the lead, but it fizzled. Still, the idea of a shadowy companion, always one step ahead, never captured, became irresistible. By the 1940s, the case had taken on the quality of folklore. Hotel staff told new hires the story of the guest who checked in with nothing but a comb, a toothbrush, and suspicion in his eyes. Travelers asked to see the room, and clerks obliged with a half-grim, half-proud smile. The hotel president had unwittingly become a landmark in America's dark tourism map. Academics, meanwhile, argued endlessly. One camp insisted that Owen was a victim of organized crime, the brutality of his wounds, and the silence around his death, marking it as a punishment. Another group leaned toward psychology, that his insistence, "nobody hurt me," revealed trauma, loyalty, or even a twisted desire to protect his killer. There was one particularly strange theory that caught fire in the 1950s. A criminologist suggested Owen was part of a secretive subculture. Men who lived transient lives, bound by codes outsiders couldn't decipher. According to this view, Don wasn't a single person, but a role, passed from hand to hand. If true, Owen might have been doomed the moment he stepped into that orbit. An odd fact emerged decades later. In 1956, a woman from Alabama claimed she had received a letter in the late 1930s, signed by Artemis, postmarked from New York. She said the handwriting resembled his, but she had thrown the letter away years before. Police couldn't prove or disprove her story, leaving only the chilling possibility that someone, perhaps Don, had tried to keep his memory alive, or to taunt those who cared for him. It is here that the debates become philosophical. Was Owen a man destroyed by chance, by being in the wrong place with the wrong people? Or was he, as some argued, the architect of his own destruction, willingly walking into a fate he knew was coming? Time may bury facts, but it sharpens questions. And in the shadow of those questions, the figure of Owen, pale, bruised, whispering to a bellboy that nobody hurt me, grew only more haunting. Decades passed, but Room 1046 never truly closed its door. By the late 20th century, the story had resurfaced in true crime books and radio broadcasts. Each retelling carried a different flavor, some coldly factual, others drenched in sensationalism, but all returned to the same impossible details. The telephone off the hook, the naked man locked inside, the strange name of Don, the stubborn refusal to name a killer. Amateur sleuths pored over archived newspapers. They tracked down Ruby Ogletree's interviews, her grief preserved in brittle clippings. Some even traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, seeking whispers of Artemis's youth. The fragments painted a picture of a boy too trusting, eager to carve a life far from home. Journalists in Kansas City dusted off the police files. They found contradictions. A bellboy's testimony about voices in the room didn't perfectly match his colleagues. The timing of Owen's injuries, how long he had been bleeding before help arrived, left troubling gaps. The truth seemed to retreat each time someone reached for it. One unsettling discovery was that the original investigation had misplaced certain pieces of evidence. The bloody towel, the broken glass, items that could have told a clearer forensic story had been lost or destroyed in the decades that followed. Some blamed incompetence. Others, darker still, whispered of corruption. Kansas City in the 1930s had a reputation for cozy ties between police and organized crime. Could Owen's case have been quietly buried for someone's convenience? In the 1980s, a true crime magazine reignited public obsession with a long article titled, "Who Was Roland T. Owen?" Letters poured in from readers who insisted their uncle, their neighbor, their former coworker had once spoken of a man who matched the story. Most claims led nowhere, but the flood of responses revealed just how deeply the case resonated. Strange fact, in 2003, nearly 70 years after the murder, a Kansas City historian uncovered a police memo from 1936 noting a tip that Owen might have been involved in bootlegging activity. No further evidence supported it, but even the suggestion brought new fuel to the theories. Was he a courier, a fall guy, or just an innocent caught in a storm? Academic debate took a modern twist. Some criminologists argued that Owen's silence on his deathbed could be understood as trauma bonding, a victim identifying with his abuser, protecting them to the end. Others dismissed this, suggesting he may not have been fully conscious of what he was saying at all. What united everyone was frustration. The case seemed designed to remain unsolved. Every lead unraveled, every explanation raised more questions, and still, in whispers and retellings, Owen endured. The digital age gave the Room 1046 case a second life. What had once been yellowed clippings in dusty archives became PDFs, blog posts, and online forums where strangers traded theories late into the night. On message boards, the question repeated endlessly: who was Don? Some believed Don was a lover, a secret relationship Owen concealed from his family, explaining his reluctance to speak. Others saw Don as a figure of menace, a handler, a gangster, maybe even a killer for hire. A few ventured into stranger territory, speculating about cult connections, secret societies, or coded symbols in the hotel's guest registry. Every scrap of the story was dissected: the lack of luggage, the drawn shades, the whispered conversations overheard by maids. Even the flowers and the mysterious Don card sent to the funeral, a gesture equal parts affectionate and taunting. What fascinated many wasn't just the violence, but the silence. Owen's choice of words haunted discussions. Nobody hurt me. To some, it sounded like loyalty. To others, denial. A few insisted it was literal, that his injuries were self-inflicted. But the crime scene made that explanation almost impossible. The hotel president itself had changed. By the 21st century, it had been restored, renamed, and polished into a luxury property. Yet beneath its glossy veneer, whispers of the past lingered. Guests occasionally requested Room 1046 just to feel the chill of history. Some claimed they heard faint knocks at night, or felt the uneasy sense of being watched. Staff didn't encourage ghost stories, but neither did they deny them. A strange fact emerged when an old employee, long retired, gave an interview in the 1990s. He claimed that in the days after Owen's death, a well-dressed man came to the hotel asking pointed questions about the boy. When told police had taken over, the man left abruptly. No record of his visit exists. Was it Don? Or someone else who wanted to be sure the story ended cleanly? Scholars continued their debates. One essay framed the case as an allegory for the fragility of identity in modern America. A young man, traveling under false names, swallowed by the anonymity of hotels, buses, and train stations. Another rejected the metaphorical angle, calling it a straightforward, botched mob killing wrapped in rumor. But perhaps the most unsettling perspective came from a retired detective who had studied the files. "We all think killers want to hide," he said. "But sometimes the cruelest act is to leave a case open, to wound a family not with death alone, but with the endless ache of not knowing why." And so, nearly a century after Owen bled out on that narrow bed, the question still hangs in the air like cigarette smoke in a closed room. Was he silenced out of fear, out of loyalty, or because he had no words left at all? The Room 1046 case has no neat resolution. No arrest was ever made, no trial was ever held, no judge, no jury, no verdict. Artemis Ogletree, known to the world for a brief time as Roland T. Owen, was buried first in a pauper's grave, then later claimed by his grieving mother. His killer, whether Don or someone else entirely, slipped into the shadows of history, leaving only questions behind. Police closed their files without answers. For decades, detectives would glance back at the case, only to admit that too much time had passed, too many leads had dissolved. Evidence was gone, memories blurred, and every path ended in darkness. The punishment, in the end, was not served to the one who dealt the blows. It was borne instead by a family who never learned the truth, by investigators who lived with unfinished work, and by a city that could never fully shake the legend of a murder behind a locked hotel door. Owen's story remains a parable of mystery. How a life can vanish into an alias, how violence can occur in the heart of a busy hotel, and how silence, a single phrase like "nobody hurt me," can echo louder than any confession. And so, after all the years, we return to that room. A man lying on a narrow bed, his body failing, his words refusing to reveal the secret. Outside, the world went on. Inside, time seemed to stop. The door has closed now. The case file rests where it was left, and the mystery of Room 1046 endures. Unresolved, unquiet, unforgettable. As the story draws to an end, I want you to let your breathing slow. The case we've traveled through together has no ending. No gavel striking wood, no justice delivered in a courtroom. Instead, it closes with silence. And that silence can feel heavier than any verdict. Artemis Ogletree's death became something more than a crime. It became a reminder of how fragile our grasp on certainty can be. A young man left home, searching perhaps for adventure, perhaps for escape. He checked into a hotel under a false name, and within days, his life was taken in a way so brutal, so baffling, that nearly a century later, we still search for meaning in it. We've walked through the shadows together. The unanswered phone calls, the whispered name Don, the funeral flowers sent by someone who never revealed themselves. And with each step, we've come closer not to clarity, but to the acceptance that some stories resist being solved. But now, as you lie back, let the weight of the unanswered rest gently instead of pressing hard. Because in the world of true crime, not every story is meant to end with certainty. Sometimes all we can do is honor the mystery, acknowledge the loss, and allow ourselves to drift into rest. So, close your eyes. The hotel lights dim, the hallway grows still, and the voices, the theories, the restless questions, they fade like footsteps down a long corridor. This case ends here.